Hey guys, it's Meya. Welcome back to the channel, and thanks for being part of this wild manhwa journey with me. Now, let's dive into today's story.
The story began with the image of a young girl slouched in her seat, her expression blank. She brought her pen to her chin and looked up, deep in thought. She reflected silently. From surviving in the back alleys, somehow, she had managed to reach her current position. But what might come next was uncertain. Perhaps, she considered, it would be wise to leave behind a diary, for the sake of future generations. As she began to write, she murmured thoughtfully, "Let's see." Her mind drifted back to the day she had been living on the streets of the slums. It was then that memories of her past life as a Japanese person had come flooding back. Ragged and worn, she had lain on the cold floor of a narrow alley, unnoticed as people walked past. She had awoken in a world rife with injustice and violence, where she had no allies. All she possessed was a simple magic that produced water, and her modern-day knowledge. Life on the streets had dragged on endlessly, each day blurring into the next. But despite the hardship, she had declared with determination that Frimchon would rise to the occasion. And rise she did. She became a valuable asset to an underworld boss. At one point, a long-headed man had loomed over her, reaching a hand toward her, but she had not backed down. Her journey continued as she was entrusted with cleaning a noble's mansion, where even the smallest mistakes were not tolerated. Somehow, against all odds, she had managed the unthinkable. She cast an explosion spell. The memory of that moment flashed in her mind, her teary-eyed face as she was launched away by the force of the blast. Back in the present, she continued to scribble in her diary, a small bead of sweat trailing from her hand down to her cheek. She reflected that, gradually, people had begun to notice her. But now, looking back on everything she had endured, she clamped her hands together and began to sweat profusely, overwhelmed by the memories. How did I survive all that? She thought in disbelief. With a loud slam, she shut her diary and exhaled deeply, a wave of relief washing over her. Maybe, she mused, it would be best to pretend none of it had happened. After all, no one would believe her anyway. The scene opened with a sky-blue-haired young lady, her deep sea-blue eyes glinting with quiet resolve. She wore clothing that matched the color of her hair and stood before a tall stranger cloaked in a long fur coat. As the stranger gently patted her head, she reminded herself to live life to the fullest and to help as many people as possible, simply for the sake of being true to herself. A new memory appeared. Frim was kneeling, drenched in water, shielding an injured person behind her. In front of her stood a fire mage, flames dancing wildly around them as the surrounding area blazed. He demanded coldly, "Hand that over quietly." Frim answered in a whisper, "Yes, for now." The memory shifted again. A much younger Frim, ragged and small, rushed around a cramped bar. Someone shouted, "Frim, help me out here," and she responded cheerfully, "Okay." It was then that her name became clear, Frim. Suddenly, the story returned to the very beginning. Frim's eyes snapped open in shock. She lay on the cold, damp ground of a back alley, her body ragged and weak. Confused, she sat up and looked around. The alley opened to a busy street where passers-by ignored her completely. Fear and confusion filled her eyes as she muttered, "Wchichwa, where?" Before she could gather her thoughts, a boy, also ragged and worn, approached her. He called out her name. "Frim." She looked up at him as he crouched down and asked, "Are you alive?" Still on her knees, she gasped, "Pakis," but then she quickly clamped a hand over her mouth, eyes wide in shock. That name. I shouldn't know it, she thought. Somehow, she recognized the boy standing in front of her, though he hadn't introduced himself. The narration confirmed, this boy Pakis was the leader of the group here. Pakis stared down at her and asked, "What happened to you?" He studied her for a moment before muttering, "So you finally learned how to speak properly, huh?" He scratched his head, puzzled. Was it always like that? He continued, more to himself than to her. "I didn't give Aniki the money, so he kicked me. Do you remember that?" Frim shook her head slowly in disagreement. Looking away with a sigh, Pakis added, "You were beaten up pretty badly back then." Frim, however, was lost in her own thoughts. "But I still remember what happened before that," she reflected. Memories from a past life surged forward. "I'm pretty sure I was Japanese." A vision of her former self appeared, a black-haired woman with glasses and blunt bangs. I worked in research, Frim recalled. I lived a completely ordinary life, repetitive, mundane days with nothing special about them. The memory showed her sitting at the dinner table with two others, idly fiddling with a TV remote. And then, that's right. She remembered stopping by a department store after work to buy a box of sweets for a client. She was on the escalator when something unusual caught her eye, a white ball bouncing downward. She turned just in time to see a child falling toward her. Without thinking, she reached out to catch the child. Though she succeeded, the momentum caused her to strike her head hard on the floor. That was how she died. Back in the present, her narration continued, my memory should have ended there. And yet, another memory emerged. Still dazed, she sat motionless as Pakis, hands behind his head, muttered, Teich. Aniki really didn't hold back with those punches. Frim remained lost in thought. The memories of this body, of Frim, they're starting to blend with mine, she realized. Turning away, Pakis muttered, oh well, time to head out and get to work. Frim attempted to stand and follow him, her legs still weak. As she stared at his retreating back, she thought silently, he's Pakis. Her eyes burned with quiet frustration. Returning to her narration, Frim explained that the area they lived in was controlled by the mafia. One of the mafia boss's sons, Duga, ran this particular district. The tall fur coat, wearing stranger from earlier? That was Duga. It seemed the former Frim had been fond of him, as we saw her walking over to sit beside Pakis, who was already crouched on the ground, slurping something. But then Frim's voice shifted in tone. Duga, she told us, wasn't someone who could be relied on. He's no good, she stated flatly. As for what Pakis and the former Frim were doing together. The scene cut to Pakis, standing in the middle of a crowded street, arms wide, mouth agape as he yelled, step right up. Everything's cheap, real bargains here. Frim clarified, they were selling water. The marketplace bustled with energy, its ancient stone structures surrounding the small stall the two had set up. Townspeople gathered quickly. Water. Fresh water here. Pakis called out while Frim lugged out pots filled to the brim. Good for your health. It's water made with magic. He continued, addressing the crowd with practiced enthusiasm. The people eagerly drank the water, murmuring to each other about how clean and delicious it tasted, completely unlike normal water. Frim resumed her internal monologue. The source of the water is... Her words trailed off as the image showed a younger, more ragged Frim with her hand outstretched toward a clay pot. The crowd buzzed behind her as she shouted, water come forth. This is the water magic I use, Frim explained. Normally, I help Pakis like this. She wiped her sweaty face with the back of her wrist, continuing, though, it seems Pakis has no concept of volume. After an exhausting day of casting water spells, Pakis finally handed her their day's earnings. Frim unfolded the small bundle. Inside was a piece of stale bread, a bowl of thin soup, and 2 measly copper coins. Make sure you eat it, Pakis said before walking away. Frim stood silently, staring at his back as he carried off the much larger bag of coins he'd hidden away. Her voice turned bitter. The breakdown is unclear, but most of the money is being skimmed off. And even that money ends up in someone else's hands. She watched from behind, slouched in a shadowed corner, as Pakis handed over the real earnings to an unknown man. Her eyes, full of sadness, dropped to the wet ground. What a cruel world this is. Still curled up in that corner, the rain now falling softly, she whispered, at the very least, but paused. Pakis, standing close by with arms folded, looked down at her. Huh? He asked. She shook her head faintly. It's nothing. Her weary, disheveled body lay back onto the damp ground. Staring up at the sky, she thought, I just wish I could see somewhere with a roof over my head. When the rain finally stopped, Frim walked quietly behind Pakis, who had his hands shoved in his pockets. He shouted something back at her, but she barely reacted. Her inner voice returned. I can't tell whether this is a dream or reality, but either way, all I can do now is fight to survive. Another image flashed, Frim receiving a brutal punch to the cheek. I get shaken awake in the morning, eat terrible food, and get worked to the bone. She walked past the town's crumbling structures, her eyes sharp and observant. The level of civilization here is low, and the state of the toilets is horrendous. Frim continued, I was abandoned by my parents, became a homeless child, and now I live as part of an antisocial group. Slipping into a narrow alleyway, she began to practice her magic in secret. Magic is said to be widespread, but apparently, it's rare for someone to produce water as delicious as mine. Just then, she noticed someone approaching. Even I'm surprised at how easily I can use water magic, and it seems to be highly valued. Which is why. A fist shot toward her face, knocking her to the ground. She writhed in pain as Pakis loomed over her, face contorted in anger. Stop messing around, he barked. Yes, she murmured weakly. Her thoughts returned. I get worked to the bone by Pakis. The water I produce seems to be favored by the boss, and I've even received pocket money as a reward, but I remember that being stolen by Pakis's superior. She sat behind the row of water pots, practicing quietly while Pakis shouted out to the crowd. Everything and everyone around me is rotten to the core, she thought. Producing water. She continued as she formed the spell once more, it's the only thing I find enjoyable. Suddenly, a rough hand grabbed her by the hair. She cried out, wincing in pain. Pakis yanked her forward, shouting, hurry up already. A nearby customer, watching the scene unfold, reached out and snapped, hey. You're going too far. Pakis turned sharply to face the man, eyes full of disdain and fury. Frim stood quietly in the alleyway, clutching the hem of her worn shirt. Her eyes were fixed on something deeper in the shadows. As we moved closer, the image became clear. It was the man from earlier, the one who had stood up to Pakis. His body lay twisted and broken, blood leaking from his mouth, his bones visibly contorted beneath tattered clothes. Frim's voice, cold and resigned, echoed in her thoughts. Anyone who stands up to Pakis usually ends up like this by the next day. Honestly, it's enough to make you sick of everything. Back in the present, she watched Pakis's back as he walked ahead. Her fingers curled into fists, her gaze sharpened with resolve. I can't go on like this. I need to find a way to escape. But just as the fire returned to her eyes, Pakis's voice cut through the moment. Hurry up and come. She didn't respond. He turned, annoyed, only to freeze at the sight of Frim collapsed on the ground. Frim? He called, stepping back toward her. He crouched beside her, watching her grunt softly in pain. What's wrong? Can't walk. One eye closed in discomfort, Frim answered faintly, my stomach. I'm hungry. Helping her lean against the wall, Pakis frowned. Didn't you eat the usual amount? A small smile formed on her face as she replied weakly, well, I'm growing, so maybe I need more. I see, he muttered. Then, without warning, he slammed his fist into her stomach. The impact dropped her to the ground, gasping. Don't mess with me, you idiot, he yelled, his face twisted in rage. Just do what I tell you to do. I've got to pay up too, you know. Still huffing with fury, he continued to kick her as she curled into herself, each blow landing hard. Then, breathing heavily, he finally stepped away. How long are you going to lie there, you lazy idiot, he spat. Frim forced herself up, wiping her face with trembling hands. Yes, she whispered. My small protest failed, she thought, but I still have a plan. Later, they walked up to a grinning old man who reeked of greed. He sneered at Frim before turning to Pakis, who handed over a bag of coins. She's not on the verge of dying, is she? The old man asked, amused. Pakis shrugged him off. It doesn't matter. Frim, now drenched in sweat, clutched her chest. It's been a few days since I woke up here, and today's the day we prepare water for the boss. Her breath caught. If I'm going to seize an opportunity, it's now. Leaning by a large wooden door, Pakis barked at her, hurry up. Frim nodded and walked forward. Boss Duga was poisoned once, she explained. Since then, getting close to management has been almost impossible. But today. She pushed the door open, and froze. There he was, Boss Duga, lounging on a couch with a twisted grin on his face. Beneath his feet knelt a ragged human being, used like a footrest. Looking up, Duga acknowledged her with a smirk. That water you brought last time, it was delicious. Frim smiled awkwardly, thoughts racing. He's terrifying, she admitted to herself, scratching her head and murmuring, thank you, Boss Duga. The man beneath Duga's feet was dismissed with a lazy wave, slumping away with silent humiliation. Duga pointed to the jar beside him. Fill this. Frim approached and looked inside the jug. Her face twisted in discomfort at the slimy, foul interior. She hesitated, then stammered, the jar, it's kind of dirty. Is it okay to pour in the water like this? Duga's eyes narrowed as he rose slowly to his feet. Frim flinched backward, the trauma from earlier surfacing in an instant. But instead of striking her, Duga's hand swept past her and grabbed the jar. You idiot, he snarled, not at Frim, but at the human footrest cowering nearby. Didn't I tell you to clean this jug? The trembling man stuttered, Did you say that? Before he could finish, Duga's fist slammed into his chin with a crack that echoed through the room. The man's body twisted grotesquely from the force as he crashed to the floor, lifeless. Frim stood frozen in the corner, shaking. Duga turned and barked at someone else, Hurry up and take the trash out. The second servant scurried to obey as Duga wiped the jar clean with a cloth. Then, to Frim's surprise, he turned to her and offered a faint smile. Thanks for noticing, he said casually. She nodded slowly, hands trembling, doing her best to hide the terror in her eyes. Still trembling, Frim hesitantly nodded. Now that they were alone in the room, fear crept into her bones. She glanced at the cloth in Duga's hand and thought, you shouldn't be wiping that yourself. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice faltered. Her knees buckled slightly under the weight of anxiety, and the words came out staggered. I am sorry, she muttered, eyes cast down. Duga raised an eyebrow. What are you apologizing for? Finally gathering her courage, she spoke. The money you gave me. I couldn't use it for food. Still kneeling, she kept her head low as Duga leaned back on the couch. What happened to it? He asked, voice unreadable. Putting on her best innocent expression, Frim replied in a soft, almost childlike tone, it was stolen by the guys over there. Duga clicked his tongue, then after a pause muttered, I see. He gestured toward the jar. Pour the water. Frim nodded, her hope slipping away as she moved toward the task. But then, unexpectedly, Duga added, come eat some snacks after you're done. Her eyes lit up. Yes. She chirped with genuine joy, catching him completely off guard. Duga blinked, speechless. A few days later. Frim practically skipped down the hallway toward Boss Duga, her face radiant. Since that day, things had changed. She told us, the number of times the boss has called for me has gone up, and the beatings from Pakis and the others have gone down. She still found Duga terrifying, but compared to before, life had become far more bearable. After finishing her daily task at Duga's place, she sold water under Pakis's supervision. But during her rounds to inns and pharmacies, she kept her ears open, slowly gathering information to increase her value in this harsh world. Sitting close to a brooding Duga, who was absently flipping a coin in his hand, Frim stole a glance at him. I have no choice but to take this gamble if I want to survive, she thought. Noticing her stare, Duga turned. Need something? He asked. Frim quickly responded, can I help you count the money? Duga looked surprised. You can do calculations? The others in the room snorted, mocking her. Just hand over the water and leave already. But Duga silenced them with a glare. Let her try. Nervously, Frim turned toward the pile of coins, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached out. Only the boss does the calculations around here. He's careful and doesn't trust anyone easily. But if I can prove myself useful, she paused, staring at the mixed heap of unfamiliar currency. Sweat trickled down her temple. This is bad. I barely know anything about this country's money. As she struggled, Duga, now sitting beside her, asked, can't do it. Frim snapped back to reality, showing him what she had managed so far. Duga looked at her, unbothered. Don't push yourself too hard. No, Frim thought, the amount doesn't matter, what matters is showing I'm useful to the boss. She stood, leaning toward the table with new determination. Tossing the coins into neat groupings, she thought, this is my field. I studied economics in my past life. Even if the system is different, I can still categorize the coins and estimate their values. With renewed focus, she picked up a coin and studied it. The markings may be foreign, but the logic isn't. She quickly got to work, organizing the coins into matching groups and aligning them in rows of 10. To her surprise, when she looked down, she had done it. Duga looked at her, clearly puzzled. How did you sort these? Smiling, Frim eagerly explained, I grouped coins of the same kind together and stacked them in 10s. That way, it's easier to tally them later. Though she hadn't finished everything, the progress was clear. Duga nodded. I see. One of his subordinates, a man named Kedon, chuckled. This kid might actually be useful. But Duga shut him down immediately. Don't interrupt. I'll knock your teeth out. Kedon backed away, still smiling. Yes, sir. Turning back to Frim, Duga asked, Where'd you learn this? Frim stammered, just from helping out a food stall once. He narrowed his eyes, then after a pause said, Start helping me from today. Frim's heart leapt. Yes. What about Pakis? She asked, a little worried. For a moment, Duga looked confused. Who? Oh, the guy in charge, she clarified. Oh, that bottom feeder. Leave him to me. Frim blushed slightly, feeling her heart rise. This is a step forward. At this rate, maybe. But just then, she saw Duga lick his thumb after touching the coins. Orkham. Boss Duga, she called out, you shouldn't lick your fingers after touching coins. He blinked at her. Ha. Some metals can be harmful, she explained. If too much builds up in the body, it can be poisonous. The moment she said poison, Duga froze. Eyes narrowing, he asked, Is that true? She nodded firmly. After a pause, Duga straightened up. From now on, you'll work directly under me. Stunned, Frim blinked. Ah, really? Let's go, he said, turning away. Frim trailed after him with a bright yes, sir. Whether he turns out to be a demon or a snake, it's still better than Pakis. Now in a room of her own, Frim beamed with joy. She had new clothes, socks, a roof over her head. No more getting soaked in the rain. Back at Duga's side again, he asked, How much were you earning per day? Frim hesitated. 2 copper coins. He raised an eyebrow. But reports say your sales were higher. She sighed. They probably skimmed the rest. Scratching his head, Duga muttered an apology on behalf of his men. Frim smiled and proposed they start selling water differently. Duga agreed, it would be transported directly now. Stay close to me, he added. Her heart swelled. Yes. Clenching her fists in silent resolve, she thought, I've made real progress. I'll make myself indispensable. Later, she ran up to Duga. Can I go clean something? He looked confused. Do whatever you want. Thanks, she shouted, dashing off. Something's always bothered me here, the toilet is filthy. As she walked down the small outdoor staircase, she thought, it gets slippery during rain. Dangerous. Looking around, she found an empty spot. Then she began chanting. With a sudden burst, water exploded from her palms, sending her skidding backward. She fell flat, surprised, but then looked at her wet hands in wonder. With just a little more effort. Back inside, Duga was grumbling, searching for Frim. Anyone seen her? Then he caught sight of her, casting water magic, spraying it everywhere as the staff watched, stunned. She noticed him and waved excitedly. Boss. I'm cleaning the hallway and the toilet. He pushed one of his stunned men aside and walked straight toward her. Frim ran up shouting, It's so much cleaner now. He patted her on the head. Not bad, Frim. She beamed. I'll do whatever it takes. Living on the edge of danger? Not anymore. With this water magic, and my knowledge, I'll survive. Duga turned. All right. Let's eat. Yes, she chirped, running after him, determination gleaming in her eyes. Deep in thought, Boss Duga held a cup of water firmly in his hand as he contemplated the strange girl who had recently joined his crew. She was unlike anyone he'd met, possessing knowledge far beyond her years, able to use water magic, and with hair no one else seemed to have. That was why he picked her up in the first place, and he didn't regret it one bit. There had to be more to her than met the eye. Snapping back to reality, he called over one of his female subordinates and asked when Frim had ended up under Pakis. She looked a little confused at first but reminded him that he had been the one who declared that the next new recruit would go to Pakis. Duga furrowed his brows, unsure if he actually said that, but the woman, a little irritated, confirmed it happened while he was drunk, and Pakis had been thrilled. Realizing he'd essentially snatched Frim back for himself after assigning her away, he brushed it off with a chuckle, muttering that she was a damn good pick anyway. Just then, Frim entered the room, huffing from exertion. She looked up and offered a small smile, whispering a greeting as she walked in. As she passed, Chief Morga, better known as Fatso, was in the middle of complaining to Duga about the recent decline in crowds at the gambling house. Frim cast a wary glance his way, already dreading the boss's mood darkening. Another subordinate quickly chimed in angrily, blaming Lookats, a rival who had opened his own gambling establishment and was siphoning off their customers. Duga muttered the word gambling under his breath, then turned to Frim and asked if she had any ideas. Caught off guard, Frim nearly shrieked. She thought to herself that while she had seen some ideas in her previous life, it would be far too strange for a child like her to start suggesting gambling strategies. Instead, she smiled awkwardly and told him she was a complete newbie. She'd never even been to a gambling house before. Duga's composure snapped. Never? He shouted. Frim immediately bowed and apologized profusely. Sighing, Duga ordered Fatso to take her to the gambling house. Frim asked if they were going immediately, pointing out that she had work. But Duga looked stern as he told her that her job was to follow orders. Besides, he said, it was always the young ones who came up with the freshest ideas. Looking directly at her, he added that he was counting on her. Without arguing further, Frim followed Fatso out, though her expression was troubled. She didn't like gambling, never had in her past life, and she wasn't eager to see what went on in such a place. What she saw next made her stomach turn. A cage stood in the center of an arena filled with screaming spectators. Blood stained the floor, and a muscular man holding a rod stood victorious. The crowd roared, demanding he finish off his opponent. Frim's eyes widened in horror when she noticed the collars around the fighters' necks. They were slaves. Watching them swing deadly weapons at each other, she wondered whether such brutality could even be legal. Her thoughts spiraled. Was this what the sordid money was funding? All the food she'd eaten up to now was likely bought with the blood money of these brutal matches. Feeling sick, she stepped outside and vomited. With one wrong move, it could have been her in the ring. When Fatso approached and asked if she was okay, she forced a smile and blamed the overwhelming smell. She apologized, then asked if she could take a proper look around. Despite her fear, she clenched her fists and moved deeper into the facility. The more she saw, the worse it became. Her steps faltered as despair settled in. She had once been hopeful, naively so, believing she could help people using her modern knowledge and magic. But how could she possibly turn a blind eye to this kind of suffering? She berated herself for her shallowness and silently apologized to the people she couldn't save. But maybe, she thought, she could use Boss Duga's interest as a cover. Maybe she could change things, even just a little. She asked a nearby subordinate to take her to the slave management area. The man, recognizing her, greeted her like an old friend. She wondered if he was Pakis's brother, Rad, though she couldn't be sure. He grinned like a fox and asked after Pakis. Frim answered flatly, saying Pakis was doing other work for Mr. Boss. When she mentioned she was scouting ideas for the gambling house, the man, still grinning, called Dugapops, and commented that he only ever went for old-school methods anyway. But then, with a sly tone, he asked if she was alone. Frim replied that she came with Fatso, but he had fallen asleep after drinking. The man chuckled and said that made sense, then gave her the go-ahead to explore, though he warned her to be careful. A place like this, he said, might eat her alive. She ignored his creepy joke and walked into a room filled with barred cages, each occupied by screaming captives. Frim wondered, if these people were also human, why were they being treated like this? Just then, a voice behind her asked if she was lost. A hand reached toward her, and she flinched, backing away in alarm. She turned to see a tall, scarred, bald man wearing a slave collar. He quickly apologized and introduced himself as Logan, the slave manager. Sensing her unease, he tried to reassure her. Frim, still shaken, regained her composure and introduced herself, saying she was acting under Boss Duga's orders and asked if they could talk. Logan crouched to her height and asked if she was alone. Frim explained that Fatso had passed out after a few drinks. Logan nodded and offered her a seat. After helping her up, he sat on the floor across from her. Frim was taken aback. Why wasn't he using a chair? Then she saw his collar again and realized he was a slave. By hierarchy, she now outranked him. The sight of his ragged clothing and scarred skin hit her hard. Tears welled in her eyes, and before she could stop them, they began to fall. Logan moved closer, concerned. She apologized, saying she didn't mean to cry. Internally, she thought how even her presence here was making things harder for him. Logan continued to plead with her to stop crying. It hurts so much to realize. I'm not even allowed to cry in front of them, she thought, wiping her tears. Apologizing again, she looked up at Logan and asked him for a favor. He blinked, surprised, as she requested something simple, something no one else had offered her in this world. She asked him to teach her what counted as common sense here. Later, walking alone through the compound, she clenched her fists in resolve. The gambling house was a cesspool of violence, filth, hunger, and disease. But she had a rare opportunity. She had the boss's attention. That gave her a temporary pass to do something. She remembered the pile of corpses she'd seen earlier. Every moment I hesitate, more people die, she thought. Standing in front of Boss Duga's door, she huffed to catch her breath, thinking about Logan and how someone as kind as him could be next. She couldn't look away, not anymore.
Pushing the door open, she stepped inside.
Duga looked up and asked if she'd found any inspiration. Frim nodded. Yes. I've got an idea, she said. Her eyes gleamed with determination. There's something I can do, she thought. Even someone like me, I'll save every life I can reach. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. It helps us out and tells YouTube to show it to more awesome people like you.